Good morning, everyone, and thank you all for joining us for Research and Innovation Week 2022. This is our fourth day of Research and Innovation Week, and I'm so excited for the program that we have scheduled for the entire day, Ethics Day. So without further ado, I'm going to kick it over to Andrew Collison, and he's going to introduce your speaker for this morning. Thank you.
Thank you, Tony. Welcome, everybody. I'm excited. Fun fact, I'm Andy. I'm the executive director of the brand new Cincinnati Ethics Center that UC started here just in January. Fun fact, before that, it was a long time coming. There was an ethics steering committee that did an ethics day last year as part of Research and Innovation Week, and I was invited to give a talk at that ethics day, and that's when I found out that Cincinnati was starting an ethics center. And then now, almost exactly a year later, here I am. And I'm thrilled to be here. And so before we get started, I just wanted to say a little bit about the theme for Ethics Day. This is part of Research and Innovation Week. And it's the theme for Research and Innovation Week was confronting crisis. And so I was trying to think what kinds of sessions could we put together that are connected to that theme. And I sort of thought of a few different crises or critical issues that I think our country and the world really is facing. One of those has to do with, I think, race, equity, inclusion. I think that's an incredibly important issue, particularly for our country. Another one is related to sort of an information crisis, how we go about getting knowledge about solving the world's problems. And then a third is just all the kinds of innovations in technology that, we don't know whether they're going to be good for us or bad for us. And then wrapped around all of that, I don't think you can confront crisis without good, effective, ethical leadership. So all of these sessions in some way connect to one of those issues, and then all umbrellaed under confronting crisis. Now, before I introduce our speaker, one thing I want to note, if you want to attend other sessions, there's a QR code right here that'll take you to the Ethics Day sessions where you can RSVP. It's not too late. Also sign up for our mailing list and you'll get info about anything else we're doing that's exciting. And then one quick thing, at the bottom, you'll have a little reaction tab with a little smiley face. Tony and Margot have done an incredible job with this week. And so why don't you all, with your little reactions, go down there and there's a little applause, or I'm going to do the ta-da celebration thing. Could you just give them all a nice hand over, and you can see it all over in the participant tab. It really has been a wonderful week, really, really good sessions. And Tony is doing this on top of trying to kickstart the digital futures building. So really, really fantastic work. All right, let's get started. This morning's session, we're kicking it off on a topic, leadership and allyship. I'm really excited to have Kristen Campbell here. When I met her, was talking about how we'd like to do something related to leadership and also connected to ethics. And she was like, well, I do these workshops on leadership and allyship. And I thought, well, that is perfect. And that's a great way to kick off Ethics Day. So Kristen Campbell is a doctoral candidate here in the School of Business doing her dissertation work on leadership and allyship. So Kristen, I'm going to hand it over to you.
Hi guys, thanks for the great introduction, Andy. It's a pleasure to be with you all and to kick off this day together and really digging into ethics and all these different crises that he was just talking through. And I think this is a great way to really get us going in this conversation, talking about how leadership can play a pivotal role in how we manage some of these ethical decisions, and they're the ones that we look for and look to when we're encountering some of those decisions, and they're often the ones making those decisions. So let me share my screen so we can dig into things. Okay, and we do. Okay, you guys see everything okay? Do like a head nod or something? Okay, perfect. And for bandwidth, I'm going to stop my video for this, but feel free to drop any questions that you have in the chat. We've got some people that are helping me monitor the chat. Thank you for the thumbs up, Margot. I can see a few people, so if you provide any reactions or raise your hand, maybe I can see this, or some of my Tony or Margot or Andy or Venus can help, me be cued in when you've got questions or comments that you want to address. So feel free to, interrupt whenever, or, drop something over in the chat. So we're talking about leadership and allyship. And like Andy said, I've done a couple of workshops, and this is really what my research is digging into and trying to understand and unpack allyship, since that has been, I don't want to say a buzzword, but a buzzword over the past couple of years. So what does this mean? Let's see. Okay, first things first, let's talk about how all of these things go together a little bit more, coming at this from a perspective of ethical leadership. Like I mentioned when we were introducing this, we look to our leaders when we are faced with ethical crises or ethical decisions that we're trying to make. So our leaders are tasked with trying to reward moral behavior. We hope and are embracing this two-way communication, especially here lately. Looking to them for making fair decisions, upholding norms and rules, using illustrative examples. And that's where allyship really steps in. Like I've been saying, the leaders are people that we look to when we are faced with these different crises, and they might be the ones that are being faced with these crises, of course. So if they're able to model ethical leadership, and part of that can be allyship behaviors, that can help break down some of the prejudice or negative biases or discrimination that we're seeing throughout different scenarios. So I want to start with this connection of leadership and allyship a little bit more. And this was the definition that actually a couple of months ago, I forget how long now, unfortunately, but allyship was deemed word of the day. And this was their definition for this. So it's the status or role of a person who advocates and actively works for the inclusion of marginalized or politicized groups in an area of society, not necessarily as a member of that group, but you're in solidarity with its struggle and point of view under its leadership. So the way that I define allyship, this is more grounded in the research that I'm doing and in the literature. Allyship really is that person who's part of the dominant or majority group member. That doesn't necessarily mean white male. We all have our own dominant or majority status and privileges that we can bring. But you're part of this majority group who works to end oppression in his or her personal and professional life through support of and as an advocate with and for the oppressed population. So you're not only doing this within your personal life, you're not doing this just for friends and family, but you're also doing this in your professional life. And that can be where we see more of this call for leaders to embrace and model this allyship behavior. So you're working as an advocate, you are supporting and trying to more or less make the experiences of others better in their day-to-day walk. So I do want to start, let's see, we've got 15 people. Let's just drop these over in the chat. If you are comfortable, can you share an example of either when you were an ally or when you had an ally? Or perhaps an example of a time when you would have wanted an ally or needed an ally. I can share a personal example just to kind of get us going on this. When I was at a previous institution during the political elections, not recently, but the one prior to, I just did not engage in those conversations. And some of my colleagues there assumed that I was part of the opposition and actually kept me out of meetings. And I didn't know how to navigate that experience. So if I were to have an ally, somebody that was, to see this, or I could have gone to, somebody and said, I don't know what this is about. Can you help me navigate this conversation? Can we address this, very seemingly minor, discrimination or microaggression, but why are they sneaking off to the bathroom without me and giggling or closing the door when I walk by? I think there's definitely miscommunication here. So that would have been a good time for having an ally. But maybe another thought question is to think about what prevents people from being an ally. Even from the perspective, why didn't I, go to somebody and ask for somebody to help me work through this situation? So I will pause here for just a minute, let you unpack some of this and open up the chat to see if anybody's able to drop in some experiences of either when you were an ally, had an ally, or when you would have wanted one. Wonderful.
Kristen, I'll go ahead and share one orally to give people time to type, if that's helpful.
Yeah, thank you.
So I once had a board of trustee at my previous institution at a dinner casually defend racial profiling in policing. And it was tempting to just get real angry and walk away, but instead I tried to flip it and I suggested, well, maybe we should, and I did this on purpose because I knew he'd get defensive, and then I'd be able to show him that's exactly what we would say in response to anybody thinking racial profiling was a good idea. I said, maybe we should just have gun control, but only for white men, since statistically white men are most likely to engage in mass shootings. So we could have like a restricted kind of gun control. And of course, he got real defensive and started giving all these reasons why that was not a good idea and why I was mistaken and how I had my quote unquote stats wrong. And then I was able to point out to him, I was like, that's exactly why people think racial profiling is a bad idea. Everything you're saying is exactly what we would say about these sort of flimsy justifications. So that's my example.
Yeah, that's wonderful. Thank you, Andy. That's a good tactic to try to flip it. If you're trying to embrace the situation, and we'll talk about behaviors. That's a good example. And because sometimes the reactions can be defensive naturally. You don't want to be necessarily told that you're, doing something that's inappropriate.
I kind of like the oral angle, so I will
Thanks,
keep
Greg.
on with that since I just don't want to type while I'm drinking coffee this morning. I'm faculty senate chair for the university here, and I'm constantly in a position to be able to speak for people who don't feel like they have the power in the position. And a lot of those people fall into the staff category. Staff are at-will employees. They often are nervous about speaking out. And since I have been staff before, I have felt that myself. And so I try to use my position as a tenured faculty member with really a much better political situation to speak out for the issues I know staff care about. But of course, and students too, to a lot of degrees. But of course, the danger in that is you're expressing indignation for someone else, and that can be dangerous because you're speaking for them rather than letting them speak for themselves. So I'm also conscious of that I also don't have the right to speak for everyone in the universe. And so I have to balance that with trying to give them cover in expressing their issues, but not exposing them to political difficulty.
I think you worded that really well. And we're going to circle back to that as part of perhaps the things you shouldn't do or things to be mindful of, so I'll stick a pin in that. But it is, as part of allyship, being able to use whatever you were talking about, authority and power, as this faculty senate chair, to help advocate for. So using some of that power or privilege that you've been afforded through that role to speak on behalf of some of these individuals. That's wonderful. Thank you for that. I see we've got two in the chat, one from Venus talking about an individual key figure in the Cincinnati arts community helping overcome roadblocks, which led to Cincinnati hosting the 2012 World Choir Games. That's wonderful. And then Eduardo, perhaps a small example, first semester in college, I was in a required literature course where a lot of other students who had already read a lot of the assigned text just had more experience. In office hours, my instructor, who was a grad student, affirmed that this was completely fine and helped me find aspects of my prior experiences that were relevant and helpful for the class. Yeah, that is a good example. I wouldn't necessarily say that that's small, because oftentimes, like we'll talk about in just a second, allyship can be confused or considered mentorship, sponsorship. So, kind of mentoring you through some of these experiences that you're facing, right? That is an act of allyship. And that's a very real active allyship, and probably an experience that more students and adults, share than we realize. So thank you for sharing those. If anybody else has any, I don't want to cut you off, but any other examples or thoughts why we might not be an ally before we move on? Okay. So before we get too deep into the actual behaviors and development of being an ally, I just want to go ahead and plug that allyship is a lifelong journey. You just shared moments in time where you either were an ally or you had an ally, but it's not a one and done sort of situation. Andy, I'm sure you continue to have those sorts of conversations when you're in those situations, in those spaces to talk about, racial profiling or gun rights, right? And Greg, it sounds like you're doing this pretty often as well within your role. So allies tend to work closely with and for someone from an unrepresented group. And they do this so that you can really understand the experiences of those individuals and help work towards those shared goals of equity. So because of this, allyship is lifelong, and it should be considered a partnership between an ally and an ally partner, because you're really trying to dig in and understand. And we'll talk about how that can be unique from an allyship perspective a little bit later in today's talk. So I believe everything that you guys were saying, we're realizing that allyship is a verb. Sometimes this is where we break down, but it's action. And this is the piece that is really making allyship different from some of the other supportive things that people do, but it's a verb. So common behaviors include listening to other group members' experiences with discrimination and oppression. You're advocating, which is one that you guys were talking about pretty frequently. And this can be advocating privately or publicly for whatever equity, inclusion, and diversity issue you're being faced with, especially as the leader. You can be an allyship by directly confronting others when witnessing discrimination and educating them about this behavior, kind of like what Andy was talking about in his example. Allies often help individuals navigate difficult conversations about others' prejudice or biased behaviors, their attitudes or thinking. And like you were saying as well, you're creating a space for voices that are often underrepresented or excluded. That tends to be, I think, when we think of allyship, we think of creating a space for people that aren't being heard, whatever that means, whether that's pausing the meeting and saying, hey, so-and-so has really great ideas. We've talked one-on-one at lunch. I think we should give this person the floor. So like physically giving them the space to have their voice and for their voice to be heard. Or perhaps advocating for, Greg, like you were talking about, and kind of being their voice when they're not at that table. And another common behavior that we see is really addressing any unfair policies or practices. This is not an exhaustive list. This is just the tip of the iceberg. So there are thousands of different ways that we can be an ally. And it can depend on what that partnership is needing and what the actual experience is, from person to person, from situation to situation. Sometimes you may need to do more of this mentoring and helping your ally partner navigate difficult conversations, or it may be that you need to step in directly, that you can tell your ally partner is kind of frozen in the moment in this fact of, oh my gosh, I cannot believe this is happening. And hopefully you have the skills and knowledge to recognize it and say, hold on a second, what is this going on, and confront this issue. And then perhaps maybe having that conversation and mentoring how to get through this together so that we don't see this sort of discrimination again in the future. So again, not exhaustive, but gives a good taste of what allyship tends to look like when we think about it, especially in the workplace. So ways that we can start our allyship development. I want to preface this by saying this is a nice circle that you're seeing on your screen, but that is not the reality. there should be tons of other little circles. This is more of a web than a nice cyclical process. But we start with this awareness, gaining awareness of your own power and privilege. That is where everything will start. And I think just by your being in this workshop and this talk today and being part of this ethics day today, you are a little bit more cued in to your own powers and privileges. As you're becoming more aware of yourself and what, positional power or authority or privilege that you bring to the table or what you've been afforded, and you start developing this partnership with an ally partner, you can gain some knowledge of others' experiences as well. And we'll talk more about how to do this in the next slide. This can be a tricky time when you're learning about others' experiences. It can be upsetting, and it probably will be upsetting as you learn what their day-to-day life looks like. We don't necessarily like to believe that people experience discrimination or oppression on a day-to-day basis, or microaggressions, which is, discrimination and oppression on a day-to-day basis. We don't realize that that has a significant impact, because we like to think their day is like our day if we're not experiencing these things, or essentially that we live in this just world. We try to rationalize and perhaps ignore some of these things, but through these difficult conversations and uncomfortable situations that we're talking through, we can really gain knowledge of what we're experiencing. Theoretically, the third step is refining and developing skills for communicating what you have learned from your ally partner or from other resources that you've been digging into to gain that knowledge about others. So you may already be great at communication. You have great conflict management skills, but navigating the conversation within the context of discrimination or bias might be a little different. So you may need to refine those skills and figure out how to work through this, especially with the idea or knowledge that this individual that you might be confronting could get defensive. So what's the best way that I can reach this person so that we can use this as a teachable moment? And that's where the action piece comes in, where allyship is that verb. And that's what sets allyship apart from other just supportive behaviors when you're actually working towards the shared goal of equity. So I say it's more like a web because as you're developing skills, maybe you're, gaining more of your own awareness. Hey, I'm really good at conflict management. I never would have thought that was the case. Great, I can use this. And that's a privilege that I've, learned or developed. And as you're gaining more knowledge about others, you're gaining more information about yourself as well. So it's more of a web, and the more you act, you want that feedback so you can figure out if this was appropriate in this situation, what can I do differently? So you're constantly growing and learning about yourself, others, and developing those skills. So if the circle helps, that's why it is a circle, but no, it's more of this very messy web as you're developing your allyship skills. I see there's a couple of things in the chat, so I'm just going to pause for a second, make sure there aren't any questions. Okay. Let's see. Okay, I don't see questions. I'm going to keep going for the time being. Okay, so other ways to really jumpstart your ally development and to start this seemingly cyclical process or start your web. First and foremost, you can conduct your own personal research and personal reading. Do some self-reflection. Sit down for a few minutes and think about what your days look like and how it might be different from your partner, or not even an ally partner, a partner or a friend or a family member. So really start trying to investigate some of the differences between minority and majority group members and the privileges that come with majority group status. And there are several self-help books that seek to address and educate about these differences. I have listed 2. These are just some that have gotten a lot of traction in the past 2-3 years, given the recent events that we've had over the past few years. There are so many more books and websites, blog posts that can help you start to really gain more of that knowledge about yourself and others. If you have a good relationship, you can initiate the conversation with an ally partner. You don't necessarily want to walk up to somebody you don't necessarily know and say, hey, I want to be your ally. How can I do this? Right? You want to start actually create a relationship, and then you can start asking questions and learning about their experiences once you've gained some of that trust and understanding and respect between the two of you. And of course, gaining skills to be an advocate. That is another way to start this development process. So attending workshops such as this, where we're really talking through what allyship is, what this looks like, perhaps attending more communication style workshops or public speaking, conflict management, things like that. Seeking feedback from your partner, like we were talking about within this web, as you're acting, ask, was this okay? Was that appropriate, or was I overstepping? So getting some of that feedback. And of course, there are other related readings as well. And this is just one that I have called out that has gained some traction as well. So we can't talk about allyship without also talking about performative allyship. And this has been getting some more traction as well lately, as we're seeing more and more people trying to be allies. We're seeing some instances of performative allyship, and that's different. So performative allyship is when someone from a non-marginalized group professes support and solidarity, but doing so in a way that isn't particularly helpful. You may also hear this being called performative wokeness. So I don't want to offend anyone, but we have so many filters on our social media where we can change, and try to raise awareness, where we will put the flag or change our profile picture, some sort of filter additive to our picture. That arguably could be considered performative allyship, because we're not necessarily we're raising awareness and professing support, but what else are we doing? What is the action piece? So authentic allyship is what I call this. This image just says allyship, but I'm leaning into an authentic allyship language. This is that active, consistent, lifelong practice. So it's not just changing my profile picture for a few weeks and then changing it back because I took a cute picture with my dog. So you're being consistent, you're lifelong and working towards these shared goals. You're working with that person and trying to seek to operate in solidarity with this group. So this isn't necessarily something that you'll see on social media. So digging in, doing the uncomfortable work, having those difficult conversations is more of this authentic allyship. So just to reiterate, we're doing so acting in support and solidarity in a way that benefits the marginalized group. So we're using whatever power or influence, expertise, skills, resources, relationships, whatever it is that we bring to the table to really advocate for individual and or structural change. So doing something that goes beyond and is trying to make a lasting impact. It may just be a lasting impact for one person, and that's okay. That is still allyship. Because while you may not see the impacts, you may not necessarily get a thank you from your ally partner. You probably will, but you may not. But that's not why we do this. This isn't why we engage in this behavior. But allyship has a ripple effect. So even if you impact one person's life, you don't know how that's going to end, how that impact on them is going to influence other people. So if you make your colleague's day a little bit better at work, perhaps they go home in a better mood. So their relationships with their spouse and their children are highlighted and are stronger and more comfortable, and you can share these conversations. Perhaps they work with their kids on their homework more because they have that time and they're not trying to decompress from the hard day at work they had that day, or they did the day before or something. So it has this ripple effect that you probably won't see. We just have to trust in the process and know that we are working towards this goal of shared equity together and trying to work towards these structural changes. So with this, we've been talking about how this is a partnership. So it's very critical to communicate with minority group members to really understand their experiences and perspectives. Like I said earlier, we like to think we have a pretty good idea of what people's days look like, and that's perspective taking. But we are arguing for perspective gaining. And perspective gaining is a little different. Perspective taking is when you are trying to walk in their shoes or put yourself in their shoes. Well, we have the same position, we have the same boss, we are working on the same project, so I feel like their day is just like my day. But if you sit down and actually ask them, having intentional and honest conversations with your ally partner, that's when some of these true experiences can start to emerge. Maybe you don't realize that they're constantly the last one that's able to get to the coffee pot because they have too many emails, because they have been, for whatever reason, I don't know. But that could have an impact. That's probably a poor example, but I hope you get the point. But by being able to, have these open and intentional conversations, you can figure out, oh, I did not realize that this was your experience. And I wouldn't have ever thought that that was something that I'd never noticed. So that's this idea of perspective gaining. I feel like I did a poor job explaining that. So let's do discussion or breakout rooms for these. I don't know, Tony or Margo, if you don't mind setting up maybe 3 breakout rooms, and we can put a few people in each room. But what I want you to do is to pick 1 or 2 of these prompts, either one of these, and go through these, perhaps even asking for somebody to role play. The first scenario would be your friend wants to talk about a recent breakup. Engage in perspective taking. What does that look like? If you are trying to imagine from your own perspective how they're feeling. And then engage in perspective gaining by actually asking the questions. What does that allow for? What do you gain from that? Another example is walking with a colleague that identifies as non-binary when you overhear a coworker telling a joke that you feel could be offensive. So how do you engage in perspective taking and perspective gaining, and what are some of the differences that you might see? So I guess here's a good spot to say perspective taking comes with limitations before we get into these breakout rooms. Perspective taking allows us to, we're only able to envision what others experience by what we experience and what we know. And that's where some of the faults occur. Perspective gaining, you're actually asking those questions. So let's break into rooms. Let me pull things back up. How were conversations? Any themes that emerged that you want to share to the group? Let me pull out the chat. Feel free to either drop something in the chat or just spend a few more minutes since we have a few more things to get through. Or if anybody wants to unmute and share some things you want to further discuss in the group, since we got cut off a little bit. Or things you want to share that were a theme that you guys were chatting through. Good conversations, ethics and surveillance.
Eduardo has a hand raised. Go ahead, Eduardo.
Yeah, so one thing that my group seemed to touch on in both cases was an interesting kind of a theme of timing, and that being relevant to how we should react in both cases and how we can take perspective in both. So in the first case, you might think part of perspective taking is considering like what kinds of information, what kinds of communication are going to be especially helpful at the point when it's a recent breakup versus the kinds of information communication that might be useful later on. In the second case, we talked about how it seemed like that kind of involves a quicker reaction because there's a kind of expected response to a joke, which is laughing. And once you don't laugh, that already is going to initiate further kinds of communication, although it depends a lot on the context, which is what our group mentioned. So something that came up was thinking about how we could slow down the interaction to both affirm feelings of potentially being offended, but also allow the colleague, if they feel comfortable, to kind of guide the next step, despite the fact that it seems like it calls for an initial reaction. So in both cases, it seems like paying attention to the role of timing was important to perspective taking.
Okay. Can I follow up on that comment about the joke and how if you don't laugh, you immediately signal something? So this is something I noticed. I think this is something that makes allyship difficult. So as cisgendered white male, one thing I find is when you're in company with other cisgendered white males who think this DEI stuff is just kind of run amok, or they don't want to, they will say things like, I think it's gone a little too far or something like that. Something they try to do, I often find, is the way they try to figure out if you're part of their club or not is they tell a joke, because there's literally nothing you can, because the thing about a joke, it's tactical because you either laugh at it or you don't. And if you laugh at it, they know you're part of the club. And if you don't, you've immediately, they basically force your hand. You either have to pretend you're part of the club or you immediately signal that you're not. And there's just that's one of the, and so I find that's actually a very common thing. Like when I encounter small groups of white men, if there's someone in there who thinks this DEI stuff has just gone too far, that's usually how they try to figure out what group you're in, because it forces your hand.
Yeah, those are great points. And I think we forget the power of reacting differently than expected can have in those scenarios. Any other last minute thoughts before we dig into a few more things? Oh, I see something just dropped in the chat. When we discussed a breakup, I think we had a good conversation about believing in yourself and learning how to be you to move forward, to get out of there and to try new things, take a trip in a group, sign up for classes, do something because you have to move on and experience life. Don't give up, you're meaningful. Yes, so trying to figure out how they're feeling and, reinforce, that you are meaningful. This breakup doesn't define you. Okay. So I see we've got about 10 more minutes, so let's keep moving because I think this is a good spot to continue. Let me see if I can minimize this. Okay. So we've talked about some things that we can do, and we'll talk more about those, or some of the common behaviors. Some of the conversation that has emerged within our breakout group and so far today in this greater setting is what we shouldn't do or things to be mindful of as we're engaging in allyship. And this may be why we don't. We need to be mindful of perceiving yourself as knights in shining armor. You're not necessarily here to save the day. We don't want to dominate the space in conversation. Like we said, we're actually trying to create space, not dominate. So it can be easy if we think we're doing a good job, we're on a good roll, we're talking for this person, but ultimately we might not be doing it right. We're still dominating the space, so we need to be mindful of that. And if it's just opening the floor, that's the appropriate move, and that's what we need to be doing. Or if you're still in this early stage as your ally partner, maybe gaining their confidence and footing to figure out how to navigate some of these difficult conversations, maybe you do kind of speak more on their behalf. So have that conversation with your partner to figure out what they're expecting and needing from you at different points in time. But don't lean solely on an ally partner to really understand the minority group experiences. You can understand their day-to-day experiences, but we're not going to rely on them to get a generalized experience of these minority groups. It's because this can perpetuate this idea and added burden of tokenism. If they want to be that person to share what common experiences are, that's fine, but don't lean solely on them. Like we've said before, there are plenty of other books, references, resources. Just go on social media and see what some of these experiences might be that others are demonstrating and showing. And another theme that emerged in our greater conversation and in our breakout group specifically was thinking about engaging when it's convenient for you. Allyship's arguably never convenient. It's always a little sticky, or can be. It can always be a little challenging. We may always fear doing it wrong or saying the wrong thing. So it may never be convenient, and that may be why we don't engage. So understanding that it's hard, and that gets us to what you should do. So taking responsibility to understand yourself and others, creating this space, like we've been saying, asking open-ended questions rather than making assumptions. So gaining perspective instead of just taking your own perspective based on your own experiences. Accepting that feedback and going into this knowing it's hard, it's challenging, and it's a lifelong journey that we're engaging in, working towards those shared goals of equity. Because it's hard, we see barriers to allyship. And that's just one, right? It's hard and sticky. So we might fear that we're doing it wrong, or even that we're perpetuating these stereotypes or making it worse. And that may be why we freeze too when we see discrimination happening. We've talked about how uncomfortable it can be. And in our group, we shared some experiences where it was like, I don't know how I would do this. I feel like I would be too angry to be able to say something effectively and eloquently, or thinking that I'm not qualified. I'm not the person that needs to be talking for this person or this group. And thinking maybe someone else that might be qualified will say something. So somebody else is seeing this. I am stuck and not qualified. I can't do this. Somebody else has to step in and do something. But that's where bystander effect comes in. This bystander effect, which you may have probably heard of, is the inhibiting influence of the presence of others on a person's willingness to help someone in need. So the more people around us, the more likely we are to think that somebody else is going to say something, to interject. Maybe they'll do it behind closed doors because they have a better relationship. I saw them cut their eyes, but they still giggled at the laugh, but they cut their eyes. So I bet they're going to talk about this during their meeting. Odds are that person is also thinking, I cannot believe somebody else hasn't stepped in already and said something, and we're all sitting here laughing. So bystander effect is very real and something that we need to be mindful of. And allyship can be a way to reduce this bystander effect. There's been a lot of research devoted to bystander intervention. So we lean on some of this as it does tie very closely, if not directly, with allyship behaviors. So 5 Ds, if you are, walking through the hallway and you hear a joke and don't know how to respond, these are some behaviors that you can engage in to help navigate some of that ickiness as you're engaging in allyship. So you can distract. So taking an indirect approach to try to de-escalate. Maybe you tell a different joke, right? We kind of veer conversation differently. We can delegate by getting help from someone else. Oftentimes that someone else is somebody with positional power or authority that maybe you don't have. Thinking someone else that's qualified. Well, let's get somebody that's qualified to use this as a teachable moment. Let's raise the awareness. We can delay by checking in with the person after the incident. I feel like that's what I would do in the non-binary joke situation that we unpacked, that case study. As we get maybe to lunch or whatever, we're walking to having a conversation. Hey, I heard this joke. Did you hear this? What's the reaction here? What's an appropriate way for me to respond in this situation? So checking in later. Of course, you can be direct, and this is more of when we think of allyship, that crux, that action piece. You're speaking up about the harassment. So that could be, directly interjecting or not laughing, right? And saying, I think that's perpetuating a stereotype. Let's not do that, right? Using that as a teachable moment. And we're seeing more and more cases of documentation, recording the incident. So that could be, we've got recorders, cameras in our pockets at all times, essentially. Could be that we're videoing the incident as it's unfolding, and we've seen that played out recently in the past few years. Could be that you're filing an HR report, right? So it's been documented, it's on paper. These are 5 Ds that have been research supports. It's helping reduce bystander effect and allyship can lean on some of these 5Ds, these behaviors, as you're navigating some of these uncomfortable conversations and situations. So allies, like we've said, it's an all day, everyday sort of thing. So how to be an everyday, authentic ally, especially from a leadership perspective, that's to embrace this idea of inclusion and to model inclusive behaviors by whatever means appropriate given different scenarios, whether that's creating a team, projects, papers that are being passed around the office or something, right? Or modeling behaviors of inclusion. That is a way that we can really work towards being an everyday ally, especially as leaders today. So I was hoping we would have time, but we don't have much. So I will share this with you, but I would like for you to sit down and take a few minutes to come up with an ally action plan. So thinking about and reflecting on past experiences, acting as an ally, brainstorming ways you can do this, and thinking of ways that you can make your behaviors more inclusive. So I will drop this file over in the chat, but I'm going to stop sharing and open the floor for any questions that you might have at this point, or
I really wish we had time for you to talk about Will Smith.
I know. Okay. You should see that file sent. It's just the one slide for this for you to unpack, but thank you all for joining today. Getting up early and spending your 9 a.m. to 10 with me. Hope you have a great rest of your sessions, and I'll pass it over to Andy.
Kristen, thank you so much. It was a great session. Thank you all for joining us. There are some links in the chat, links to the upcoming sessions. There's a link to a feedback form. It'd be great if you could fill that out for us. And also on that topic of gaining knowledge and doing your own personal research, if you're here for the equity and inclusion piece of this, the John Fort session at 1:30 today, you'll get information about how you can get free access to his course, online course called The Black Experience in America. Great way if you want to start doing some homework and research. So definitely check out that session at 1:30. And I'm going to hand it back to Tony and Margot. Tony, Margot, do you have anything to close us out?
Nope, just thank you all for joining us, and hope to see you for the rest of the day.
Right.
Thank you.
Thank you all.
See ya.
Hope to see you soon later.